That morning, as I was driving home with Boone sitting beside me in the truck, I never expected that everything in the neighborhood would change forever. A wave of unease washed over me as I saw the HOA workers planting strange potted plants along the street. They had bright red leaves as tough as steel, and the roots seemed to twist together as if they were ready to invade everything. I stopped staring at these plants, feeling like something was wrong. Boone started growling, his eyes locked on those strange plants as if they posed a threat. The nightmare began the next day. The neighborhood's drainage system was completely clogged. Water began to rise, flooding the streets. The nearby families realized that the creeper plants weren't just invading flower beds, but had also infiltrated the gas system of one house, causing an imminent risk of explosion. But that wasn't the worst of it. My neighbor, Marta, called me in a panic. The creeper had burrowed into her garage, completely destroying the electrical system and plunging her entire house into darkness. That was when I realized this wasn't just about a few plants anymore. This was an ecological disaster, and the HOA had put us all in danger. I couldn't stay silent any longer. They had to pay for this. Marlene Hicks is the president of the Oak Ridge Hollow Homeowners Association, HOA, a woman in her 50s, always impeccably dressed in expensive suits and flashy jewelry. She carries herself with an air of authority that demands respect, but in reality it's a facade built on arrogance and power. Marlene lives for control, always considering herself the final decision-maker on every issue in the neighborhood. She's notorious for her stern, no-nonsense attitude, but in truth, she thrives on displaying power and the HOA's interests, regardless of the consequences. Marlene always believes she is right, and defending the HOA's interests, even at the expense of the community, is something she deems perfectly justified. She couldn't care less about what I or anyone else has to say. To her, there's only one issue: the HOA is always right. When I arrived at the HOA office, I thought the meeting would simply be a discussion about halting the creeper plant project. However, I wasn't prepared for the cold reception from Marlene. The moment I stepped into the meeting room, she greeted me with a forced, almost mechanical smile, as if she were just going through the motions. "Mr. Baker, so nice to see you again," Marlene said, her voice sweet but insincere as she sat down behind her large desk. I could see the condescension in her eyes, as if I were just an inconvenience. I wasted no time. "I need you to understand that the creeper plant is causing real damage." The creeper was blocking the drainage system, damaging properties, and even affecting the gas systems in some houses. "Mr. Baker," she replied, leaning back in her chair, arms crossed. "As I've said before, this plant is part of our sustainable landscaping initiative. We can't keep living with outdated concerns." Marlene's voice was calm, but her tone dismissed me entirely. Marlene didn't listen, and her attitude grew colder. "You're not the first one to come in here with a stack of documents. These plants have been reviewed by experts, and they're perfectly safe. I suggest you leave it to the professionals." Her voice was final, like she had no patience left for this conversation. I was angry, but kept my composure. "You can call your experts, but they didn't see what I saw. This creeper plant is not just an aesthetic feature. It's causing real damage to this neighborhood." But my words didn't seem to matter. Marlene sat there in silence, her eyes still calm. "We'll handle it, Mr. Baker. The community trusts us, and you're just one voice." Her words were like a slap in the face. As I walked out of her office, the last thing she said stuck with me. "We'll take care of it, Hank. The community trusts us, and you're just one voice." But as I walked out, something hit me. The HOA wasn't just ignoring the danger, they were actively covering it up. The moment I left, I felt the weight of her words. The HOA wasn't making a mistake. They were concealing the truth and hoping I would stay quiet. After that meeting with Marlene, things in Oak Ridge Hollow seemed to spiral out of control. The HOA under her command continued planting the creeper without hesitation. They acted as if everything was fine, dismissing my warnings with a wave of the hand, assuring me that they had professionals handling it. But the problems were becoming undeniable. It started small. The first sign of trouble came after a heavy rain. I'd been living here long enough to know how the drainage system worked, but this time something was different. The streets had flooded, and I couldn't help but notice that the water wasn't draining the way it used to. What had been a minor inconvenience a few months ago had now turned into a significant issue. As I walked down Ridgeview Lane, Boone trotting by my side, I could see the telltale signs: water pooling in front of several houses, gutters overflowing, and streets turned into murky ponds. The creeper had begun to invade the storm drains. The plant's roots, which I had first noticed creeping across the neighborhood yards, were now burrowing into the underground pipes. I decided to take a closer look. With Boone at my side, I walked from house to house, inspecting the damage. As I passed the storm drains, I bent down and peered inside. What I saw made my stomach drop, roots thick and tangled snaking through the metal grates, clogging the pipes completely. It was clear the creeper was wreaking havoc beneath the surface. The smell was the next thing that hit me, damp, musty, and foul, like something had been rotting underneath the pavement. The water wasn't just stagnant, it was contaminated, turning into a breeding ground for bacteria and mold. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. This was a health hazard. The next day, I heard from Jerry, my neighbor, who lived 2 doors down. His voice on the phone sounded strained, as if he was already on edge. "Hank, you didn't put anything in my yard, did you?" I frowned, confused. "What are you talking about? There's something spreading into my flower bed. It looks like ivy at first, but the leaves are all wrong, red, not green, and it's creeping right up to the foundation of my deck." I thought I was imagining it at first, but now it's everywhere. I told Jerry to send me a photo. When I saw it, my worst fears were confirmed. It was the creeper, its roots spreading like wildfire, working its way into the foundation of his deck. The plant had clearly found a way to establish itself underneath the surface, infiltrating private properties without warning. I knew this wasn't just a minor issue anymore. That same week, Barbara, another neighbor, flagged me down during my morning walk. She seemed frantic. "Hank, there's something wrong with my rain gutter," she said, her voice trembling. "It's completely clogged. When we checked, there were roots, red roots poking out. I think it's coming from the creeper." I followed Barbara to her house, and when we checked, sure enough, there they were. The creeper's roots had made their way into her rain gutter, blocking the flow of water and causing it to back up and overflow. Her yard was soaked, and parts of the garden were now flooded with standing water. The smell was overwhelming, like wet earth mixed with decay. I could tell this wasn't a simple matter of a few plants. This was escalating fast, and the damage was starting to spread throughout the neighborhood. The more I walked around, the more I realized that the creeper wasn't just taking over gardens anymore. It was beginning to invade the infrastructure of Oak Ridge Hollow. The flooding, the clogged gutters, the cracked foundations, they were all connected. The creeper was more than just an aesthetic issue. It was a living, creeping problem that threatened to tear apart our homes. I spent hours that afternoon walking the entire perimeter of my property, taking photos of the creeper's spread and documenting what I was seeing. The vines had spread along fences, crawled into the flower beds, and were creeping into the edges of my yard, slowly but surely. I took pictures of the roots of the clogged drains and of the damage it was causing to the structures around me. I couldn't just stand by and watch as this plant tore through the neighborhood. This wasn't just about a landscaping decision anymore. This was a biological threat. Later that night, I pulled up everything I had found on the creeper and made a folder full of evidence. I included the photos, messages from my neighbors, and articles about the damage invasive species, like the creeper had caused in other areas. I knew the HOA wasn't going to take me seriously unless I had hard proof, and I had it now. The problem was bigger than I'd thought, and I was starting to feel a sense of dread settling in my chest. This wasn't just about pushing back on the HOA. This was about stopping a disaster. The next morning, I decided to do something I hadn't planned on. I was going to the HOA office again. I wasn't going to leave until I got some answers. After a few days of quiet frustration, the reality of the creeper's invasion began to hit home. The flooding was getting worse, and the damage was no longer isolated to a few homes. As I walked through Oak Ridge Hollow, it was becoming clear that the creeper wasn't just a nuisance. It was a serious threat to the entire neighborhood's infrastructure. What started as minor flooding had escalated into visible cracks in sidewalks, crumbling foundations, and once pristine yards now teeming with invasive roots. My neighbor Jerry wasn't the only one complaining anymore. A group of us, mostly the older residents who had lived in Oak Ridge Hollow for years, started to notice strange shifts in the neighborhood's landscape. The creeper wasn't just spreading across yards anymore. It had begun to cross the boundaries of private property and was infiltrating common areas that the HOA had jurisdiction over. The more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't just the neighborhood. The public spaces controlled by the HOA were at risk too. I contacted Barbara and asked her to meet me at the community park one afternoon. The park had always been a gathering place for families and neighbors, with a small pond in the center and a trail that led through the woods at the back. But now, as we walked around the area, I could see it clearly. The creeper had taken hold. It was climbing up the walls of the benches, wrapping itself around the trees, and even creeping into the little pond where it had already begun choking the plants that had been there for years. "Look at this," I said, pointing to the vines that snaked up the side of the playground equipment. "This isn't just an aesthetic problem anymore. This is going to destroy everything." Barbara frowned, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I knew something was off, she said, but I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. She glanced at me, her expression full of worry. This isn't just some plant anymore, is it? No, it's not, I replied. This is bigger than all of us, and it's spreading into the common areas the HOA controls. They have responsibility for this. It wasn't just the public spaces that were affected. As the days went on, I saw more and more signs that the creeper was affecting utilities as well. It had started creeping into the base of the streetlights, curling around the power lines, and even began appearing in the storm drains in the park, causing them to back up. If the HOA didn't take action, the damage could spread much further. The creeper was already disrupting the natural flow of water, and I was starting to fear it might cause structural damage to the roads if left unchecked. By the end of the week, I had gathered all the evidence I could. Photos of the plants overrunning the common areas, the clogged storm drains, and cracks in the sidewalks caused by the roots. I knew I needed to take this to the HOA again, but this time, I wasn't going alone. I called in Clara Pena, a local environmental specialist who had experience with invasive plants. I asked her to join me at the next HOA meeting, where we could present our findings to Marlene and the rest of the board. I showed up early to the community center on the night of the meeting, feeling a mixture of dread and determination. The gymnasium, which had been converted into the HOA's meeting room, was already filling up with residents. Most were just there to hear the usual updates on neighborhood maintenance and upcoming events, but I wasn't there for small talk. This time it was war. When Marlene took the stage, I could see the smug confidence in her eyes. She had no idea what was coming. I stepped forward with Clara and opened the binder I had prepared. I'm here to speak about the Crimson Creeper, I began, and the damage it's causing to our homes, our public spaces, and our infrastructure. I held up the photos of the creeper strangling the park, invading yards, and clogging the storm drains. The board members shifted uncomfortably, but Marlene's face remained a mask of calm. She wasn't going to let me get away with challenging her authority. We've already discussed this, Hank, Marlene said, her voice smooth and controlled. The creeper is part of our initiative to make Oakage Hollow a greener and more sustainable place. You're making something out of nothing. These plants were carefully vetted by professionals. Professionals who didn't know what they were doing. I shot back my voice, growing firm. You have ignored the evidence, Marlene. The creeper is invasive and it's damaging our homes. The HOA is responsible for maintaining these public spaces, and this plant is choking them out. The community is at risk. But Marlene wasn't listening. She shot me a sharp look. This meeting is not a scientific forum, Hank. We'll continue with our plans. If you want to fight this, you're welcome to send us your reports. But you don't control what happens here. That was when Clara stepped in. I'm a certified environmental specialist, she said, her voice calm but authoritative. I've seen the damage the creeper is causing, and I can tell you it's far worse than Mr. Baker is letting on. This is an ecological threat, and it's not just about aesthetics anymore. She opened her own folder and handed out official assessments. The creeper is accelerating the decay of the local ecosystem. If left unchecked, it could lead to flooding damage to infrastructure and loss of biodiversity. The HOA's actions are only making things worse. For a moment, the room fell silent. The board members exchanged glances, but Marlene didn't flinch. She simply nodded, signaling that the meeting should move forward. That night I left the meeting with the distinct feeling that the HOA was more determined than ever to protect their decision no matter the cost. But I wasn't going to back down. I couldn't. Not when the neighborhood was at stake. After the HOA meeting, I could feel the tension rising. Marlene and the rest of the board had made it clear that they weren't going to listen to me, and my attempts to warn them about the creeper plant were falling on deaf ears. I knew something had to change, but I hadn't realized just how quickly things would spiral out of control. It was a week after the meeting when the real damage started to show itself. I'd spent the past few days walking the neighborhood, documenting the spread of the creeper, taking photos of the overgrown vines wrapping around fences, climbing up walls, and choking out native vegetation. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened when I visited Marta, an older woman who lived a few streets over. Marta was always one of the first to lend a hand during snowstorms or community events, and we had become friends over the years. When she called me that morning, her voice was shaking. "Hank, something's wrong. I think the creeper is in my garage." I rushed over immediately, Boone trotting beside me. When I arrived, Marta was standing on her front porch, visibly shaken. "It's in the garage, Hank," she repeated. I didn't know how bad it was until I tried to open the door this morning. The vines, they're everywhere. They've burrowed through the foundation. I walked into the garage with her, my stomach sinking as I took in the scene. The first thing I noticed was the strong smell of damp earth mixed with something more chemical, almost like rot. And then I saw it. The creeper vines had already invaded the foundation of her garage, creeping through the cracks in the concrete. The vines were tangled around the baseboards and wrapped tightly around the electrical wires running along the walls. The vines had even begun to crawl up the wooden beams supporting the structure. I could see how deeply embedded they were. This wasn't just surface-level damage. As I moved through the garage, I noticed something that sent a cold shiver down my spine, a small pool of water near the base of the wall. I knelt down, feeling the damp ground with my hands, and there it was. The vines had punctured a copper pipe running through the garage, and water was steadily dripping out. This wasn't just about some cracked sidewalk anymore. This was real structural damage. If Marta didn't get this fixed soon, the whole garage could collapse. But that wasn't even the worst part. I could see where the roots of the creeper had pushed through the walls, invading the inner workings of her home. She was standing there helplessly watching as her life's work, her home was slowly being consumed by a plant that had been introduced without any thought to the consequences. I took photos documenting everything: the vines wrapped around the electrical wires, the copper pipe, the structural cracks, but I knew this wasn't enough. I needed something more, something bigger. This wasn't just Marta's problem. It was a problem for the entire neighborhood, and I was determined to make the HOA see that. The next day I went straight to the HOA office again, my heart racing. I had been to the HOA countless times before, but this was different. I wasn't going to let them off the hook this time. I marched in, photos in hand, ready to show them the real consequences of their negligence. But when I got there, things had changed. The office was abuzz with activity, and as I stepped inside, I could see that Marlene was holding a meeting with a few other board members. I approached the front desk, and Dawn, the receptionist, gave me a quick glance before going back to her work. I knew she'd been briefed on my previous visits and wasn't thrilled to see me again. "Is Marlene in?" I asked, my voice firm. Dawn hesitated for a moment, but then she picked up the phone. "I'll let her know you're here," she said, not hiding her annoyance. When Marlene emerged from the back room, her usual composed demeanor was starting to crack. Her smile was thin, forced. "Mr. Baker, what brings you back this time?" she asked, her voice tight. I didn't waste any time. "I've got evidence, Marlene," I said, pushing the photos across the desk. "I've seen what your plant has done to Marta's garage. The creeper has infiltrated the foundation, destroyed her plumbing, and is causing damage to her home. This is no longer a landscaping issue. This is a public safety issue, and it's only going to get worse if you don't stop this now." Marlene glanced at the photos briefly, but there was no sign of concern on her face. "Mr. Baker," she said with a dismissive sigh, "we've already addressed these concerns. This plant was vetted by professionals. It's part of our plan for a more sustainable neighborhood." I leaned forward, my voice steady but firm. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about a sustainable neighborhood. This is about real, irreversible damage. I don't think you understand what you're dealing with here." She paused for a moment, but then her eyes narrowed. "I don't have time for these dramatic accusations, Hank. The HOA board has already made its decision. We're moving forward with our plan, and if you continue to interfere, we'll have no choice but to take legal action." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about plants anymore. The HOA wasn't interested in protecting the community. They were only interested in protecting their own agenda, no matter the cost. Frustrated, I left the office, but I wasn't going to give up. I had a decision to make. I could either keep fighting this on my own, or I could take it to the next level. It was time to bring in the experts, the authorities, and make the HOA face the consequences of their actions. The day after I left the HOA office, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the stack of evidence I had gathered. Photos of the creeper's damage to Marta's garage, images of the flooded streets, cracks in the sidewalks, and even video footage of the plant crawling through the storm drains. Every corner of Oak Ridge Hollow was being affected, and it was clear the HOA had no intention of acting. They had dismissed every attempt I made to get them to listen. The truth was, they didn't care. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had tried reasoning with them, but they had ignored the warnings and mocked my concerns. It was time to escalate this. I was going to bring in officials, people who couldn't be brushed aside or silenced with empty reassurances. I made a few calls, reaching out to local environmental experts and contacting the county authorities. I was going to get someone with real authority involved, someone who could force the HOA to act. By mid-afternoon, I received a call from Marcus Tran, an environmental inspector I had worked with on past restoration projects. He was familiar with invasive species and the damage they could cause. I briefed him on the situation, and after a few minutes, he agreed to come out and see the damage for himself. He was the kind of guy who didn't mince words. If something was wrong, he'd call it like he saw it. Later that week, Marcus arrived with a small team of inspectors and a couple of county code enforcement officers. I met them at the entrance of Oak Ridge Hollow and led them straight to Marta's property. The minute Marcus saw the damage to the garage, his face fell. He didn't need me to explain what had happened. The evidence was right there, the creeper roots tangled in the walls, the ruptured pipes, the electrical wires now exposed. Jesus, Marcus muttered as he inspected the damage. He turned to one of the code officers and gestured at the foundation. This whole structure is compromised. The creeper isn't just invasive, it's structurally damaging the property. We need to get this plant out of here before it spreads further. The code enforcement officers took notes and photographed the damage, but I could see the concern in their eyes. It was clear that they understood the severity of the situation. Marcus pulled me aside and lowered his voice. "Hank, this is bad. If the HOA doesn't do something about this, it's only a matter of time before more homes are affected. The creeper is already in the drainage systems and has started to push into the infrastructure. This could get a lot worse." I nodded, feeling a wave of frustration and helplessness wash over me. Marlene and the HOA board had ignored every warning, every piece of evidence I presented. I had reached out to them in good faith, but now the consequences were clear. They were actively allowing this destruction to continue. Marcus didn't mince words. "We need to involve the State Agricultural Bureau and bring in hazard teams to assess the scale of the damage. This isn't just about landscaping anymore. It's a public safety crisis." Within hours, Marcus had made the call, and the county officials began drafting a report to forward to the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ. The wheels of bureaucracy were finally in motion, but the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Why had it taken outside authorities to get anything done? The HOA had the power, the resources, but they had chosen to ignore it. The next day, I received a call from Rachel Den, the reporter I had worked with months ago when I first started gathering evidence on the creeper's spread. She was following up on my previous story and had received a tip from a whistleblower inside the HOA. Rachel had been investigating the issue for weeks, and now she had more information than ever. "We've got something," Rachel said when I picked up the phone. A source inside the HOA told me that Ted Coburn, the HOA vice president, has been getting kickbacks from the supplier of the creeper plants. The supplier's nursery is based out of Arizona, and they've been pushing untested invasive species to communities like Oak Ridge Hollow. The deal was for cheap plants with a promise of massive discounts, and it looks like the board turned a blind eye to the risks. I felt a rush of anger and disbelief. Ted Coburn, the self-proclaimed director of aesthetic harmony for the HOA, had been pushing these plants for financial gain. That was the real story here. The HOA wasn't just negligent. They were involved in a corruption scheme that had put the entire neighborhood at risk for personal profit. Rachel had already pitched the story to her editor, and the local news station was moving forward with an investigative piece. It wasn't going to be just another fluff piece. This was going to expose everything. The truth about the creeper, the financial incentives, and the hoax Marlene and the HOA had been selling to Oak Ridge Hollow for months. As the State Agricultural Bureau sent in their own experts to inspect the creeper, the situation began to gain more traction in the media. News vans appeared at Oak Ridge Hollow, local residents began to speak out, and the community started to demand accountability from the HOA. For the first time, I felt like we were making real progress. The state was involved, official assessments were underway, and the HOA could no longer sweep the issue under the rug. But Marlene and the rest of the board weren't going to back down without a fight. They immediately sent out a mass email to the entire neighborhood, trying to spin the situation. "The HOA is aware of the ongoing concerns regarding the creeper plant," the email read, "and is taking the necessary steps to address the situation." It was all damage control, no apology, no acknowledgement of their mistake, just more PR spin. Still, the news was out, and with each passing day, more people were standing up against the HOA. It wasn't enough to simply call for change. Now we were calling for justice. The HOA had crossed a line, and they were going to be held accountable one way or another. By the time the State Agricultural Bureau sent its final report, things were no longer just a matter of neighbors disagreeing over landscaping. The creeper plant had now become the symbol of the complete failure of Oak Ridge Hollow's HOA. And while Marlene and the board tried to keep up the appearance of control, everything was starting to unravel. It was just days after the county's environmental hazard report had been released when the first major breakthrough came. A former employee of the landscaping company that had been hired by the HOA, an anonymous whistleblower, reached out to Rachel. This person, who had worked closely with Ted Coburn, revealed that the HOA had not only been aware of the risks posed by the creeper, but had also actively concealed them to protect their financial interests. According to the whistleblower, Ted had been getting kickbacks from the supplier, a shady nursery in Arizona that specialized in untested invasive species. The plants had been sold to Oak Ridge Hollow at a deep discount, all in exchange for a promise of future business. This information was explosive. Rachel quickly turned it into a breaking news story, and within hours, it was all over local television stations. The HOA's involvement in a corruption scheme prioritizing cheap, harmful plants for the sake of profit was now front and center. The fallout was immediate. I watched the story unfold from my living room as Rachel appeared on screen, talking about the kickbacks and the fraud that had been going on behind closed doors. For the first time, I felt like we were winning. The HOA's pristine reputation built on controlling the community with ironclad rules was crumbling. They couldn't hide the truth anymore. But Marlene wasn't giving up that easily. The very next day, she sent out another email to the residents of Oak Ridge Hollow, claiming that the news story was nothing more than a smear campaign designed to discredit the HOA and disrupt the community. She tried to downplay the severity of the creeper issue, saying that everything was under control and that the HOA was working with experts to resolve the situation. But no one was buying it. People were angry. I started receiving emails from neighbors who had never spoken to me before. They were asking for help, some even sending me photos of the creeper spreading in their yards. Others were sending their own complaints to the HOA, demanding answers. I knew the tide was turning, but I also knew it wasn't over yet. One afternoon, as I was walking down Hollow Glen Street, I ran into Glenn, a neighbor from the east side of the neighborhood. He was pacing nervously, his face pale. "Hank," he said, stopping me in my tracks. "I found something in my garage. It's bad. It's the creeper. It's getting into the gas lines." My heart skipped a beat. I followed Glenn to his home, and when he opened the garage door, I could see the damage immediately. The creeper had breached the concrete foundation, and its roots were crawling up the walls and around the pipes. The worst part, it had wrapped around the gas line, threatening to cause a major leak. Glenn was visibly shaken. He didn't know what to do, but the danger was clear. I pulled out my phone and began taking pictures, documenting the damage. As I did, I could feel the weight of what was happening. The HOA's negligence had caused this, and now it was affecting real people, putting their homes, their lives in jeopardy. It was no longer just about a plant or a few broken pipes. The creeper was threatening public safety, and if we didn't stop it soon, it could lead to something far worse. Explosions, fire, you name it. I called Marcus immediately and told him about Glenn's gas line issue. Within the hour, Marcus arrived with his team of county inspectors. They confirmed what I already feared: the creeper had compromised the gas system, and there was a real threat of an explosion if the plant wasn't removed quickly. The emergency response team was called in, and Glenn was forced to evacuate his home as a precautionary measure. The situation had reached a tipping point, and the HOA's actions could no longer be ignored. As the day wore on, the news spread. I could hear sirens blaring in the distance as emergency crews worked to contain the situation. Residents were on edge, and the HOA's damage control tactics were failing. Marlene and the board tried to put on a brave face, but they were in full panic mode now. They tried to say everything was fine, but their words were falling flat. The evidence was overwhelming. The creeper was no longer just an invasive plant. It had become a serious hazard, one that could destroy entire properties, cause gas leaks, and even injure people. That night, I received a call from Rachel. Her voice was excited. "Hank, it's happening. The state is stepping in. The Department of Environmental Quality is launching a full investigation. We've got the authorities involved now, and the HOA can't just keep hiding behind their lies." My heart raced as I realized just how far things had gone. The state was finally involved, and there was no turning back. The HOA's grip on the community was starting to loosen. But even with all the progress, I knew this wasn't over. Marlene and the rest of the HOA were still in power, and they weren't going down without a fight. But I wasn't backing down either. I had come this far, and I wasn't about to stop until every last one of those creeper vines was eradicated, and the HOA was held accountable for what they had done. The day the city held its emergency meeting to address the creeper crisis, I knew it was make or break. For months, I had been fighting alone, gathering evidence, sounding alarms, and being ignored. But this time, it was different. The entire community was on edge, and everyone from residents to authorities was ready for a resolution. The tension in the room was palpable as I walked into the municipal building. The city council chamber was packed with residents, reporters, and lawyers. The atmosphere was thick with frustration. At the front of the room, the council members sat behind a long table, their eyes scanning the crowd. I took a deep breath, gripping the edge of the podium. I had been here before, but this time, I wasn't just a concerned neighbor. I was the person standing up for the entire neighborhood. I was ready to expose the truth. As I began my speech, I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me. My name is Hank Baker. I'm a resident of Oak Ridge Hollow and a former officer with the U.S. Forest Service. I've been tracking the spread of an invasive species crimson creeper in our neighborhood. It's damaged homes, clogged drainage systems, and put our community at risk of serious destruction. I paused, letting my words sink in. I went on to explain the damage it had caused to multiple homes, including Marta's garage, and how it had breached gas lines, putting residents in danger. The health and safety risks were undeniable, and I made sure to mention that the HOA had ignored all the warnings. I even pulled up the photos of the gas leak in Glenn's garage and the damage caused to the park. This is not a minor landscaping issue. This is a public safety crisis, and it's time we take action. As I finished my speech, there was an uncomfortable silence in the room. The council members exchanged glances, and I could feel the weight of the moment. Then the door to the back opened, and Marlene Hicks stepped forward, flanked by the remaining members of the HOA board. Marlene, usually composed and self-assured, was visibly shaken. Her eyes flickered nervously as she scanned the room. "Mr. Baker," she began, her voice still laced with the same condescending tone she had always used. "We appreciate your concerns, but we have had the creeper plant vetted by professionals. It was part of our sustainable landscaping plan for the neighborhood. There's no need for all this panic." She waved her hand dismissively, as if the situation were nothing more than an inconvenience. I could feel the anger rising within me, but I held it back. "Marlene," I said, locking eyes with her, "this isn't just about landscaping. The creeper is an invasive species that's causing structural damage to homes, clogging utilities, and putting lives at risk. You were warned. You were given the evidence. And yet you continued to push this plant on the neighborhood." I paused, my voice steady but firm. "And now people are sick, homes are destroyed, and gas leaks are endangering families. The HOA has a responsibility to protect its residents, not profit off their ignorance." The room was silent as my words sank in. Marlene's face flushed red with anger. "This meeting isn't about your personal vendetta against the HOA," she snapped. "This is about community unity, and you're trying to tear that apart." But the damage was done. The residents in the room were no longer buying her lies. I could see them murmuring among themselves, exchanging knowing looks. They had heard the truth, and they couldn't ignore it anymore. Marlene's defense was crumbling in front of everyone. The truth was finally out in the open, and it was impossible to deny. At that moment, I could feel the ground shifting beneath the HOA's feet. The community was no longer divided. We had all been hurt by the same plant, the same HOA's negligence. The residents began to speak up one by one, sharing their stories of damage and frustration. The council members sat quietly, nodding, taking it all in. The situation had reached a breaking point. It was no longer just about a plant. It was about accountability. The HOA had tried to control the narrative, but now the community had taken back the power. After the heated exchange at the council meeting, the room buzzed with murmurs. It was clear the tide was shifting, but we weren't finished yet. I could see Marlene and the board members fidgeting in their seats, clearly rattled by the mounting pressure. But this wasn't just about words anymore. It was time for action, time for me to bring out the hard evidence that would leave no room for doubt. I stood up and gestured to the projector behind me. A large screen flickered to life, and I began running through the documentary evidence. I had compiled photos, video logs, official reports, and emails I had secured from the whistleblower inside the HOA. This was the moment I had been waiting for. As the slides changed, showing the spread of the creeper through the park, into the gutters, and into private homes, I watched the faces of the council members as they began to take it all in. On the screen, I displayed photos of Marta's garage vines wrapped around exposed electrical wires, creeping through the foundation and up the walls. The destruction was stark, but the worst of it was the gas leak I had discovered at Glenn's home. A close-up image showed the creeper roots wrapped tightly around the gas line, a clear and present danger. The text accompanying the images detailed the emergency response team's report, confirming the immediate risk of explosion. Next, I showed a video clip I'd taken of the creeper in the storm drains. The footage taken from a GoPro camera, mounted on a fence, captured the vines creeping into the pipes, clogging them, and blocking the flow of water. The video was clear the creeper wasn't just a landscaping issue, it was infiltrating the very infrastructure of Oak Ridge Hollow. Then, I dropped the final bombshell emails from the whistleblower inside the HOA. These emails contained correspondence between Ted Coburn, the HOA vice president, and the Arizona nursery supplying the creeper. One email in particular stood out where Ted openly discussed the kickbacks he'd received in exchange for pushing the creeper on the neighborhood. There it was in black and white, the confirmation I had been waiting for. The HOA wasn't just negligent, they were corrupt. I glanced around the room as the evidence sunk in. Marlene was visibly sweating now, her hands gripping the edges of the table. The other board members were exchanging uneasy looks, their confident postures now deflated. "Is this the type of leadership you want, Oak Hollow?" I asked, my voice cutting through the silence. "A board that puts profit over safety, that disregards the well-being of its residents just to save a few bucks on plants. This plant, this crimson creeper, is destroying our community, and it was all enabled by your decisions." There was a long pause. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. The weight of the evidence hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Then a hand went up. It was Councilwoman Danvers, the woman who had been quiet throughout the meeting, her sharp eyes never leaving the screen. "Mr. Baker," she said, her voice calm but unwavering, "we've seen enough. The evidence is clear. The creeper is a dangerous invasive species, and the HOA's actions have been nothing short of reckless. I believe it's time to take action. The board of Oak Hollow must be held accountable." The room erupted into applause. Marlene's face went white as the council members started nodding in agreement. The tables had turned. For the first time, the HOA was on the defensive. The community, the real victims, were now in control. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it. The applause that filled the room after Councilwoman Danvers' declaration was brief but thunderous. The weight of the truth had finally broken through the defenses of the HOA, and their downfall was imminent. It was clear that the council and the community had turned against them, but Marlene and the board weren't ready to admit defeat just yet. Marlene stood stiff and pale, her hands gripping the edges of the table. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, now wavered with an almost unrecognizable tone. "This isn't how it's supposed to be," she muttered under her breath. "We followed all the guidelines. The plants were meant to be good for the environment. No one's buying your excuses anymore, Marlene." I cut her off, my words loud and clear. "You've endangered the entire neighborhood for the sake of profit. The creeper was never vetted properly, and you ignored the warnings. Now people are paying the price for your mistakes." The council members exchanged looks. For the first time, there was a glimmer of doubt in their eyes. They were beginning to see just how deep the corruption went. It wasn't just the board that was falling apart. Ted Coburn was also absent from the meeting, and whispers began to swirl about where he had gone. Rumors had already started to spread. Some said he had left town to escape the mess he had helped create. Others claimed he was quietly making deals with his lawyers. The truth was, no one had seen him for days. But it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. Marlene tried to compose herself, but the cracks were obvious. Her usual icy exterior had melted under the weight of the evidence. We didn't know how bad it would get," she stammered, looking for any escape. "We were just trying to make things better for the neighborhood." "Stop lying, Marlene." The words felt like a punch to the gut. "You were warned, over and over, and now people's homes are damaged, their health is at risk, and you're still trying to make it sound like you were just trying to help. You were paid off by a company selling dangerous, untested plants. This was never about what was best for the community. This was about greed." The council members leaned in, their expressions stern. It was over. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no way out for her now. Councilwoman Danvers, the same woman who had remained quiet throughout the meeting, now stood up with a decisiveness that spoke volumes. "Marlene Hicks, Ted Coburn, and the rest of the HOA board are hereby removed from their positions. Their actions have been detrimental to this community, and their negligence has put our residents at risk." There was no applause this time, just a deafening silence, a moment of finality. The council had made their decision, and Marlene's reign was officially over. The HOA was finished. Marlene's face turned a deep shade of crimson. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She stood there trembling as the reality of her situation set in. This was no longer a fight she could win. It wasn't just the council that had turned against her. It was the entire community. The people who had once followed her orders, trusted her leadership, now saw her for what she really was, a fraud who had put their homes in jeopardy. In the chaos of the meeting room, a few residents spoke up, expressing their relief and even anger at the board. A few stood and left in protest, their backs turned to Marlene and her failed leadership. It was like the veil had been lifted, and for the first time in a long time, Oak Hollow was no longer under the oppressive control of the HOA. I could hardly believe it as I stood there watching the downfall unfold. A weight had been lifted from my shoulders, but I knew that the work wasn't over yet. The creeper plant still needed to be eradicated, and the damage done by the HOA wasn't going to disappear overnight. But today, we had won. The community had stood up for itself, and we had taken back control. The mayor of W. Cliff County, who had been quietly observing the entire meeting, stood and spoke. "Effective immediately, all HOA decisions will be suspended. The city will assume responsibility for all common areas, and the Environmental Task Force will begin immediate eradication efforts. The room erupted into cheers. The final blow had been delivered. The HOA's grip on Oak Hollow was broken. The people had spoken, and the creeper, along with the corrupt leadership that allowed it to spread, was finally being removed. As I walked out of the municipal building, I felt the first real sense of relief I'd had in months. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned, and I knew that Oak Hollow would never be the same. No longer would the HOA be allowed to dominate us with their unchecked power. Accountability had been achieved, and that was a victory for everyone. The day after the meeting, Oak Hollow felt different. The weight of tension had lifted, replaced with a newfound sense of hope. The streets, once silent with frustration, now hummed with a quiet energy. Neighbors were out in their yards, chatting with each other, coming together in ways we hadn't seen in years. It felt like a breath of fresh air after a long period of suffocating uncertainty. I walked through the neighborhood, Boone at my side, and saw people I hadn't spoken to in months or ever offering their thanks. Jerry, my next-door neighbor, who'd never been one for confrontation, gave me a hearty handshake, his eyes filled with gratitude. "We couldn't have done it without you, Hank," he said, his voice full of emotion. Barbara from down the street came over with a loaf of freshly baked bread, her smile wide as she handed it to me. "I never thought we'd see the day," she said. But it wasn't just the personal thanks. The sense of community was palpable. The rift that had been growing between neighbors, fueled by the HOA's divisiveness, was slowly starting to mend. People were speaking to one another again, offering help where it was needed. It was as if in the face of the crisis, Oak Hollow had found its unity again. And it felt good. The legal consequences for the HOA were swift and inevitable. Within a week of the council's decision, the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality had issued a formal cease and desist order to the HOA, halting all further planting of the creeper and demanding the immediate removal of the existing infestations. Marlene Hicks, Ted Coburn, and the rest of the HOA board were officially under investigation for violating state environmental laws. The kickback scheme was now part of a larger criminal probe that was looking into not only their illegal activities, but the broader financial mismanagement that had contributed to this ecological disaster. The HOA's assets were frozen, and a class action lawsuit was filed by homeowners whose properties had been damaged. Marta received compensation for her garage's structural repairs, and Glenn was awarded a settlement to cover the damage caused by the creeper to his gas lines. Other residents who had suffered similar damages followed suit, and the HOA was legally bound to reimburse them. Marlene's public apology was a hollow, forced gesture with no real remorse behind it. She had hoped to salvage what was left of her reputation, but the damage was done. The community wasn't listening anymore. The transformation of Oak Hollow didn't end with the legal victory. The community, once torn apart by the HOA's oppressive control, was beginning to reclaim its soul. The empty spaces, once filled with unwanted creeper vines, began to blossom with new life. The HOA's failed landscaping plan was replaced by something more in tune with the true spirit of the neighborhood, a community garden. Residents, many of whom had never spoken beyond a wave, came together to plant native species working side by side. We chose plants that wouldn't strangle the land, but would help it thrive: wildflowers, sunflowers, and flowering vines that welcomed bees and butterflies, not destroy the ecosystem. Marlene Hicks and Ted Coburn may have fled to avoid the legal consequences, but the real karma came when the remaining board members were banned from serving in any future HOA positions. The city of Oak Hollow stepped in, and the Neighborhood Collective was born, a voluntary democratic association where every resident had an equal say. I walked through the newly restored community garden one afternoon, Boone by my side, and stopped at a bench near the old retention pond, now being carefully restored. As I sat down, I noticed a small native clematis vine curling up the fence, its soft green tendrils, a quiet reminder of the battle we had fought. It wasn't just a plant. It was a symbol of what we had reclaimed: our land, our community, our future. As I looked out at the garden, I smiled. The war was over, but in its place, Oak Hollow was thriving again, and this time it was ours. Looking back, the win wasn't what mattered most. It wasn't the moment the HOA collapsed, or the lawsuits that followed, but the quiet, steady process that got us there. The law, not anger, was our true ally. While frustration is easy to fall into when you see your home and community under threat, it's the careful collection of evidence, the patience to go through the right channels, and the courage to persist that make real change possible. There were moments when it would have been tempting to escalate things, to lash out at those responsible, to let anger lead, but that would have only caused more chaos. It was evidence, not emotion, that shifted the tide. Standing up legally, fighting within the bounds of the law, helped us expose the truth without further damaging what we loved. It wasn't about getting revenge, it was about ensuring something like this never happened again. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember, keep records, keep calm, and know when to call for help. Legal action isn't about rage. It's about holding people accountable through the right channels. And never forget, communities stay strong when people respect the law, and power only exists when it's unchecked. I look at the community garden now, the clematis vine twisting gently in the breeze, and I see a quiet reminder of what happens when people come together to protect what matters.